Okay. No. All right. Okay, we're going to call the next scheduled Board of Supervisors budget meeting to order. So if we could all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. Does anyone have any township updates? Nope. Community Day was very successful on Saturday. We had a little bit of rain during the middle of it, but nothing too heavy and didn't seem to put a damper on a lot of people's spirits. So thanks to everyone that helped out. It was really a really good time. So that's the only thing I can think of. And then we don't have any public, but we will ask for any public comment. Nope. Public comment on agenda items. Nope. And moving on to business.
And not able to see the ambiance in the room. So good evening, members of the board, staff. My name is Christopher Himes, Township Manager. I'll be presenting the proposed first workshop session here for our general fund summary for FY24, which includes some elements of stratification of funding allotments from not just 24, but from 24 to FY28. So we're always going to hopefully provide at some point in time, like a snippet of 5 years from current plan year to the end of that scope of time for all of our budget materials. So people have an understanding kind of where we're on path to from terms of where we are to where we're possibly headed to. Okay, next slide. So tonight's general fund summary includes everything but a completely finalized proposed budget for public safety, considering we still have to finalize those individual general fund summaries from both Southern Chester County Regional Police and Avondale Fire Company, of which, we are participants in a larger level, Public Safety Commission and just a contributor towards. So I believe the PSC meeting being this week, we're going to be reviewing that. Once we finalize at the PSC level, we'll finalize it at the October 23rd budget workshop presentation, as well as the following enterprise funds for open space, airport, and the hydrant fund, which will have we do tonight, the public safety meeting with those enterprise funds. We'll have kind of a fully workshopped FY24 budget. And then only thing from a timeline perspective is that would provide any follow-up commentary that you might have at the 23rd meeting from today. We can provide it there. I was going to try to provide a brief synopsis update in the upcoming October 16th Board of Supervisors meeting and the public agenda. And then all of this with the plan in early November to have one more earmark workshop prior to the November Board of Supervisors meeting, where based off of all kind of inputs to date, if no further, and we're at a solid place, we feel we would motion to advertise for the final adoption in December. So just a quick update on the timeline of where we're at right now. All right. So before we hop into kind of where we are from FY24, and that's fine, you can leave it on this slide. Wanted to kind of provide a little bit of like a review of how we got here in the first place. So with that, I tried to provide the most kind of, I guess, confusing overview of our overall general fund summary of actuals, as well as our amended 23 amount from FY19 to 23. And the way to think about this is the top numbers is what we actually had in terms of, sorry, step out here and kind of walk around the top part is what we have in terms of actuals for the fully fleshed out budget. But with that, there were some elements where we had some pumped up kind of numbers because of higher levels of expenditures out, mostly in our transfers to funds from FY19 to 20, which kind of increased our expenditure allotments, as well as some repeated actuals for ARPA funding and other kind of grants fundings that raised our revenue through course of a few years. So what I wanted to try to understand is what is our hard expenditures as it's been tied to our operating budget in the general fund, sans kind of, I'll call them amplifiers that we've received over time, because this is when we're talking about building kind of what we wanted to do in 24, which is a needs-based, kind of almost zero-based budget, and then grow your expenditure fund, expenditure summaries per department accordingly. I want to know true up where we actually are from an actual standpoint, both from a department line item perspective and then kind of a larger level year over year perspective. And so that's kind of where we kind of provide like the overall summary here. So this is what's actually on the actual reported budgets. This is kind of my ability to understand kind of what our true position was from an operating summary, if that makes sense. All right, so you keep on clicking. I just wanted to highlight some areas here. So from FY19, and you can click the next one because it's going to encapsulate kind of. So the township had some revenue increases. Most of that was through Act 511. We'll kind of show some of those increases as well. While also overstating its position with some extra ARPA and cash as it came through, especially in 2021. We influxed the budget with revenue. So that's why we saw 7.2 million. It wasn't truly a $7.2 million position. So when you're looking at that, you know, that was kind of mostly because of our initial year for ARPA. We had some reported MEF grants, which this was in supporting of the Baltimore Pike intersection study that we reported on the general fund side. And then of course, the final kind of I'll call it consolidation effort that we had from remaining transfers from the sewer fund. And so we reported that as like the sinking fund transfers of capital as well. So it was an extra revenue reported there. And of course, in expenditures, you can see what we used to distribute out. And of course, this was mostly when we had the realized cash from sewer sale, and we increased some of these final transfers out. You know, we no longer transfer out of the general fund at this rate. Now we're kind of, obviously this was from 22, 23, we're at 243,000. So you can see that net position kind of dramatically decreased over time. So what this actually ends up looking like is you can see at some point in time in FY21, true up, there are some things that have increased and decreased in terms of staffing, in terms of cost summaries, but you know, we had a 1.2 million almost structural surplus in our budget in terms of kind of true up operating revenues versus true up operating expenditures. And we'll explain kind of how this position shifted from being a net structural surplus to a net structural deficit. But go ahead on the next bullet point here. This was the Act 511 revenue increases that we saw. So from 2019 to 2021, we had a kind of a net increase of about almost $600,000 for our Act 511. And you can see for the most part, real estate transfer tax during COVID, obviously rates plummeted, housing purchasing activities skyrocketed. And you can see in that kind of time in the general fund, we kind of rocketed up a little bit. Well, you know, in the later part in the summary here, you can see that actually start to come back down. Housing mortgage rates increased pretty dramatically over the course of the last, 18 months specifically. So you're not going to have as much activity happening here. So that's one where planning going forward, more of a true up understanding that that was an anomaly. We're probably not going to experience those revenues year over year over year into perpetuity. And we're going to be kind of more realistically kind of aligned towards where we were pre FY20 numbers, pre-COVID numbers. Another one was in terms of earned income tax. Now I tried to find kind of a specific reason of why we got that net increase. And it was not in 1 year, it was kind of an accrued balance increase. But if you click on the next little bullet point here. So another one is high activity with high skyrocketing prices. Those people that can afford those prices kind of competing against each other. You likely had an influx of higher AMIs coming into the township. So your actual median income for people who purchase house that was, remember when we talked about kind of the housing market increase, you know, they're purchasing houses that are now upwards of almost $200,000 above their prior kind of market values in a span of 2 years. Well, that kind of quote unquote housing market feeding frenzy probably occurred more towards those who had higher level income seeking to come and rebase themselves in New Garden Township. And then the other one was as we finalized the Pemberton townhouse community sales, kind of all went on book in 21. So, I mean, I guess the good news is if you have a robust market and demand, this is the kind of growth that we can experience as a township, specifically when we're looking at future developments. So it's one to kind of think, because this was only for 83 units and a housing market, but we have some other housing opportunities coming up for some planned developments in the course of the next few years. So this is another one to kind of keep in the back burner. We're likely to possibly see another kind of EIT lift from those. So it shows you the value of EIT growth for the township. Next slide. However, at the same time, and as we were kind of leaning out away from transfer expenditures, we kind of assumed some of that margin with planned growth for staffing levels. So FTE count kind of went up during the same time span. And most of those being tied towards public safety kind of initiatives. We also had some payroll increases. So in the total aggregate amount, we actually went from this surplus balance into a sign of a net structural deficit balance. So right now, that's being realized in our structured use of cash, of which case that is a budgeted number, not an actuals number, because there's no real line item expense that goes solely towards budget use of cash. It's kind of a measure to put in there to balance the budget. But from a planned expenditure standpoint, right now, I think we're on a glide path to spend probably about $950,000 this year in actual structural cash. And it was somewhat nominally lower than that. I think it was between what, 250 to 300,000 in years prior. So we're kind of on a growth plan like that based off of our kind of assumed FTE increases related to payroll expenditures, that it's not one where you can just structurally use cash to balance the budget, experience kind of ebbs and flows and total cost for the township and walk away from without using that cash. Like you're now holistically committed towards that. And then in that same time frame, not increase the real estate tax base, which we've talked pretty exhaustively about, to kind of supplement that as well. So long story short of saying that we went from this position to this position. Now, this isn't to say that this should be our true operating expenditures. We were still woefully understaffed and inadequately kind of competitive from a salary standpoint. And our public safety contributions were pretty well below par for the surrounding region. So there was some significant need to right size, and we're still kind of in a proposed element to do so, but it's just showing that this shift has gone from one way to the other way. And the importance now that we also balance that with proper revenue streams based off of our cost appetite as a township, what we need to fund services, and kind of benchmark wise competitively where we are and where we sit in the region. And then another one is pull that dependency away from cash, because it's no longer just a structural number in the actual budget. It is what we're using. And that's actually spending down. Remember that one slide we did from the state of the township brief, that kind of cash summary, we're on path to consume our cash right now. That is happening. All right, next. And sorry, yeah, that was more explain that one. So next slide. So going over some revenues, kind of in that same effect. You can probably just keep on clicking on these just to kind of guide the conversation here. So this was that real estate jump that we experienced from FY19 to 20 to 21 and stayed on path here in 22. You'll see in a future slide, but I could probably bring it up now. We're probably going to be about, because this is what we had planned for 23, we're probably going to be about 100,000-ish below this number for real estate transfers. So it fell off a cliff kind of thing. And that's because of the lending environment and just the slowdown that we've had. And also with no new growth, there's nothing else to really plus up those numbers. So from 20 to 22, we actually experienced a rate of overperformance to our budget. So these are actuals, not what we had budgeted. Year over year, we outperformed our budget by about 30%. And then this year we're coming in at 77.5%. So we're under performing that budget number over there. Same thing for EIT, very similar fashion. You can see we outperformed it by about 12.5% during that same time frame. This one we're coming in at 97.5%. So almost to the 100% rate. But as you can see, EIT being the number that it is, a loss of $200,000 is only about a couple percentage points there in the total EIT, but that's still a significant amount of revenue when you think about the value of EIT and the magnitude of it as well. So any ebbs and flows there where we go somewhat of an underperformance, we're going to have to make up that margin. And there's not a lot of places to make up that margin in our revenues other than if you have a buffer built into your real estate taxes, or if you do have underperformance, this is where you would want to compensate with smaller buckets of ending cash fund balance. So you have your beginning cash, your ending cash, and then you kind of plan to hit your numbers. But if you do come in, those were the buffers, but not structural to subsidize as a payroll cost expense throughout the entire fiscal year. Oh, that probably should be only the one that we sent out to the board members. So, okay. Okay, great. And so this is what I was talking about earlier, the 279. This is actually what we're still measuring right now. We're updating Q3 actuals right now. But if things kind of stay the way they are, this is the cash number that we have to account for at the year end. And right now, it's kind of stands alone because the only thing that we have to absorb this type of reduction in revenue is cash, general fund cash. Next slide. So this is the expenditure summary. So when we talked about what we added during that time frame, costs add up quickly when you're talking about where we are in terms of our overall operating expense. So $5 million in our general fund operating fund is actually not that much of a significant number. And then where we actually added those. So we added public safety, we added people for our public works, and then we did kind of onesies, twosies across the board for the areas of our departmental needs, which were significant needs to the township. So when people ask about those increases, you can say that they were justified, required positions and staffing increases to help support township operations. Because if you look at most benchmarks prior to, I guess in FY23, the township town hall specific with public works, we were at about just over a 50% staffing rate compared to our jurisdictional counterparts. So the average for us as a township is usually somewhere between 20 to 23 FTE for a township of our size, rows, size, square miles, population base. This is independent of policing and, associated kind of unionized people in terms of the police associations. And we were roughly about 10 to 11 FTE throughout the course of that entire time. Most of that was in our public works department. So we had a town hall staff usually between 4 and 5 people. So we were woefully understaffed. So like I said, this isn't a hit at all on the township. These are things that we needed. We just needed to scale up with scale ups increase in real estate taxes at the same time frame. But just a quick summary on this. You can just kind of, as the bullet points come. So from year end FY21 to 23, this is kind of where we flipped. We went from that 1.2 million surplus to that kind of structural deficit right now. And you can see for the most part, in terms of the total 2-year increases, this is kind of where the biggest majority of the lift came during that between FY22 going into FY23. And these were the ones that we adjusted for in FY23's budget amended projected for the FY24. So this is new in FY24. This is FY21 to 22 and 22 to 23, if that makes sense. So without, obviously, I'm kind of repeating myself by going through some of these, but the big thing here is that of the total net, and so this is the net 3-year expenditure increase budgeted wise. So this is bottom line. This is the difference between total expenditures. And this is just tied to all of these 3-year net increases just for these specific areas. It's about 90%, 96% total all increases. So when we talk about this is what we did, this is why. Like this is pretty covers everything. So when you have that total expenditure increase as well as a net kind of revenue loss, that's where you start coming into the margin for additional cash, because you're having to compensate these types of increases with less of a primary tax revenue from our EIT and our real estate property taxes. So the one thing you're hitting here the worst is our cash balance. And that was seen right now in FY23 the most, because this is the first year it's kind of come into full effect. So FY24 produces an additional increase of 642. That's for all the net year-over-year planned increases, which gets us to our total net increase. And for the FY24 positions, you can see those are the increases all the way into the column on the right. And we'll talk about those whys and what we're adding as we walk through the budget here. But at the end of the day, this is kind of where we get to, is a 21 FTE organization, less police for having at least one staff member equivalent for all individualized functional areas across the townships. And that wasn't the case. We had whole areas where we just didn't have a personnel even addressing it in prior years. So based off of what we have in the township, let's say prior to FY21, we were on the path to purchase 3 full-scale public parks, and we had nobody operating parks. You know, that's the kind of levels I'm talking about. You know, we had all of the land developments that we had across the board, and we had one person responsible for everything from the top end down to the full kind of daily property code maintenance type stuff. You know, so we were just not staffed to the levels commensurate to what we have here in the township. If we were a more rural locality with less of a population base, maybe, but that's not what we are. All right. So this is the proposed general fund summary going forward in terms of total net revenue. And these are kind of the classification categories stratified out for all departments. But the big one here, as you'll see, and we'll talk about the actual EIT impact, is the total proposed real estate taxes right size. And so right now our budget has this about 1.4. With the increase, it gets us to about 3.2 million at the top there. So you can go ahead and click through some of these here. But the good news is you can see the percentage of revenues as it's distributed right now, that's roughly about half of that percentage base right now. So the biggest lift, of course, is coming there. You can keep going. So this was the one thing that we talked about in terms of how much more cash do we have left. If we had just continued to structure the cash, we're using it because that's how it's balancing our budget from operating expenses. We'd be out of general fund cash by May of 25. So that's the path we're on now. General fund insolvency by 2025 May. That's the expenditure rate that we're currently experiencing. Now we could do some measures. We would basically push and defer all of our upfront expenses and then bleed it out, but we wouldn't get through FY25. And so then we would have to seek exposure towards our sewer sale balance, and that kind of compounds into a lot of other issues as it pertains to funding commitments in its totality for the township, which, if you remember, the sewer sale balance is creating that interest income surplus cash that's helped supporting capital projects at the current moment. So if you go back, the only thing here to note is that, as we talked about in the previous capital planning cycle, is the planned increase to support solvency in our capital fund, as we are talking about a complete kind of cash-based approach. Primarily, we're going to be trying to chunk into that with grants, but it's primarily through a cash without increases in transfer until we get to a certain point where we no longer have the kind of capital cash on hand to fund projects. We would have to replenish that capital fund with what was deemed to be the more realistic transfer rate that we should have. And you can see from prior year transfers, we actually used to transfer about $900,000 plus. This is growing us back into a $750K total net transfer. And albeit it's not going to all of these stratified out enterprise funds, it's going directly towards our capital cash account to support direct support of projects, if that makes sense. All right, next slide. So here we're talking about total net FT increases. So you can see in FY20 where we were at versus FY24. And so at this point, you can think of it as this was about 50% of where we should be. So based off of some other benchmarks that we have, townships of our size, like I said, they average somewhere between probably 19 to 24 FTE, dependent upon just kind of small variations between staffing preferences that work for other townships. This is one for us that within a ±1 margin, this is kind of where we should be staffed as an actual township organization. And then, of course, those are the ties towards your total net payroll expenses, which at the end of the day, you kind of want to be somewhere for your staff on hand, kind of in that like 20 to 30% type margin in terms of total payroll expenditure. So that's kind of the total net footprint of wage related expenses to the township is about 27% of our total recommended operating budget here. So just to kind of show kind of that's what you're getting. Less than a third of your budget is going towards payroll expenses for having a fully staffed organization. So it's all we consider to be in a pretty strong position in terms of allocation percentage and making sure you have coverage across the board to do what I can say to be kind of required services, because everything over here, this is the stuff we have to do. Like this is the minimum kind of stuff. The one thing that I wanted to also make sure is not only do we have a guarantee to finally meet kind of the minimum required services, but what in addition to that? And so we'll go through some line items here. So I think we pretty much made but the biggest one here is and have the capacity to achieve extra kind of curricular goals and objectives for the township. So if you're just showing up and able to kind of complete the day's worth of operations, that's one thing. But if you can also commit your time available based off of staffing support that you have to also achieve those extra functions of what we try to do, which is try to get projects moving forward, execute things in accordance with your comprehensive plan, you're able to do more with more support. So this allows us to be fully staffed to do the day-to-day and meet strategic objectives for the township, which we were never staffed really to support that. And that was one issue that the township, when you're talking about, we were pretty well aligned to complete certain objectives in the comprehensive plan. Most of those were related to open space because we had a full board put in place and it was well funded. You can see that actually achieved. And then everything else, stormwater, some of the other things related to development, new growth, all of the stuff we're not able to do that because we don't have the people in place we did not have the people in place to pursue those types of objectives for the township. So this being kind of the 5-year point, my hope is that we could actually have this plan in place and start measuring ourselves against comprehensive plan objectives for the next 5 years before we have to consider possibly updating our plan and just see kind of what improvements we're able to make in terms of progression towards those goals. And that would be what we would actually try to update in next year's State of the Township brief, which is less of a kind of, benchmarking of where we're at for financial reasons. It's more of a, hey, let's measure our successes in terms of where we're at in executing our comprehensive plan and updating the residents accordingly. Another one is this plan actually keeps us competitive at current compensation rates. So the market is ever increasing. We were never even close to even achieving it. If you remember from the prior brief, across all major department areas, staff was either at a 5% or 30% plus margin lower than base compensation based off of 2021. So not only were we understaffed, we were wholly underpaid as well in terms of an organization. And so that led to a lot of staffing turnover, which once again, now you're not able to meet objectives and you can't do basic services. So that was another weak point of us that we hope to address and kind of stabilize. And that's one of the big things is I see 24 plan as kind of a final stabilizing moment in time for the township to have continuity of the same people involved with everything year over year over year. So one thing is, most people don't think about kind of examples across the board, but I wanted to kind of spotlight one, just like your standard public works labor. These are people that are doing kind of a daily grind type of work and kind of where we were versus where we came. And this is what the kind of growth plan was for them. So if you can just kind of click through these real quick. In 22, the baseline was, and this is less than 2 years ago, $18.50 an hour, which Chester County Consortium is a market study kind of group that provides details for benchmarking kind of where you're at as you report them in surveys. And in that survey, there was 31 listed Chester County municipalities. This is townships, some boroughs. So it gives you kind of a good kind of cross section of who's doing what. There was 24 reporting ones in the survey. And of those 24, we were 23rd at this rate. We were almost dead last. And the 24th one had one person on a part-time rate. So technically we were last place. So that's where we were not only 2 years ago. So then we decided as a township to increase that measure, but we lifted it up a little bit to 23's rate, which was last year. And we were budgeted to have, I believe it was 8 total FTE less the director position at a somewhat for all the laborers, which was, I believe was 7 FTE at 23 an hour, which by that same measure got us from 23rd to 16. So we went from bottom to bottom 2/3, but still kind of in that lower end range. And an issue with that is we had those positions vacant and open for over half a year because it was very tough to find qualified people and personnel to come in who have CDL licenses, that have all of their certifications and have any experience professionally at all whatsoever to be able to come to the township. So it's one where we put this number at the board, but it still wasn't competitive to be able to get people. And we experienced that, which is why when we had the possibility of we have a retiring personnel in December, and then we had some work kind of labor lost in terms of, I think it was like a health issue, on limited duty for one member of our crew. Yeah, so we had somebody that was on getting workers' comp. Those reductions almost critically shorten your capability for having a workforce in place. So when we talk about robust budget plans to do paving programs and bridges and all these types of transportation improvements, stormwater, you can only meet certain objectives of those. So we were able to meet our objectives with paving program and our objectives with the bridge project, but we weren't able to do much with stormwater. And that's kind of thing, other than just kind of basic level kind of maintenance and inspections and stuff. So that's kind of thing, when you have a full staff, you can do everything. So what will look like a significant increase of net 31%, and this is the 24 proposed budget for 24 rate of 2690. This number would only get us to about 11th out of the 24 of the 2021 study. So this is marking competitive 3 years ago. That's kind of where we're at. And that's what we can do to support that increase right now. But that's the realistic understanding of what this number actually achieves the township. So it's still, not at the upper ends. It keeps us competitive kind of in the middle, and we'll kind of look to see when they update that survey, kind of where this breaks us out, but at least it's a significant improvement. So if, we can possibly use this to recruit new people should we have to, or at this case, retain employees who might be considering other options. Some other general fund changes that we did. So one measure that we wanted to discuss was some structural changes. And so the biggest thing was simplification for all our stratified fund accounts in terms of enterprise funds, because when I say enterprise funds, I mean a fund that is supported through structural revenue. And we had two that were not, and that was the New Garden Hills Fund and the Recreation Fund or Parks Fund, whichever one I always forget. They were propped up with transfers out of cash just to support kind of basic level maintenance type functions, but not necessarily a structural enterprise fund. So to me, my recommendation was to, number one, simplify, reduce those accounts, pull them over into a broader Parks and Recreation Department operating budget in the general fund. And then with that, see if there's some room for some consolidation and simplification. So basically is, can we address the cost? Because right now we're kind of spraying the budget chart across 3 funds of non-related expenditures that, from what we saw, was actually not really needed. And so this kind of simplifies things a little bit. So if you want to walk through the slides here. So we, in the 24 proposed budget, you'll no longer see those Parks and New Garden Hills funds separated. The whole point was, if we have a parks related project, it will be reported in the capital fund as a capital fund expenditure. And then all ongoing maintenance operations will be supported at a general fund. So as we walk through, the Recreation Fund had FY23 expenditures of 125. You can click the next one. New Garden Hills was at 155 too. Those were just supported for total net expenditures. And so if you say, oh, we're going to pull these over, that means you're going to inflate your general fund by $280,000 if you were just to kind of pull everything over. But that wasn't necessarily the case, because our total actuals projected from these 2 funds was only going to be 169,000. So there was, and that's full years of projected 12 months of actuals. So if you keep on clicking through. So for the Park and Recreation Department, that's our current number. So we would think that there was going to be somewhat of a consolidation, which is why in the State of the Township brief, we just said, estimate wise, let's just say, assume that we're going to add 200K to the proposed 24 budget. That was at least to get us to understand kind of total increases across the board. And that's what we ended up using. But as we kind of went through all of our actuals and talked about certain expenditure requirements and stuff, this is actually how much we need to pull over. So not this number, but this number. So now we took a budget of 280,000 and turned it into an actual requirement of only 132K. And that's what we actually end up adding to our total final proposed general fund budget for Parks and Recreation Department. And that was because there was some kind of overlap between overestimating repair costs, overestimating maintenance costs. We looked at about 4 years of maintenance kind of requirements. And there's just certain areas that we were kind of overextending our budget requirements with not having significant actuals to support and justify some of those cost measures. But those are budgeted requirements. So if we're going to propose a tax increase to support 24, you want to make sure that you're supporting only what you need. And that's what this kind of exercise provided here. So if you can think about it, consolidations led us from having total requirements of this to total requirements of 324. So we saved $150,000 out of our proposed general fund, which gave us some room. And the biggest thing on that was just the impact was on cash, because we were transferring funding money out of our cash account to support those as well. So one example of what we ended up doing was just general maintenance and repairs. As we looked down all 3 funds, we saw a lot of overlap opportunities, but 186,000 was what was forecasted within those funds, and actuals were only going to be a little over 50,000. So We ended up proposing it to be 106, and you'll see this actual stratified GL kind of breakdown when we actually walk through the budget here. But this is inclusive of total kind of like annual maintenance and repairs. The goal was not to support capital type projects out of the maintenance and repairs budgets from these. So like if we had something proposed for the Lyceum House or the Quonset hut, let's just propose a capital project for that and fund it as an independent capital project, because now you can expense all engineering costs, all associated construction costs with one project and account for it in one, and it doesn't impact your year over year cost projections. You're only doing routine type stuff. And this also included some additional measures, because in addition to this, we also had some small engineering costs, because there's always those spot up engineering kind of like assessments that are required along the way. So this kind of fully supports those as well. So that was just one example. I kind of went into hyper detail, but this is the level of analysis that we did across the board for every single department. This is an example of it, but going through everything with a fine-tooth comb was a good exercise, kind of like a zero-based budget needs assessment for all departments. Another one is, some of these enterprise expenses, as it goes towards multiple different departments, it made more sense to consolidate. Number one, to look at our total usage requirements. Two, simplify invoicing and AR, AP, because even if you're not able to save money from the actual expense, you're saving time, labor, and effort from our finance department having to process for one type of bill, 26 different bills to go through all different types of avenues on our GLs for all the different departments there. I think, how many different electrical bills do we have? 22 electrical bills per month. So it's just one of those ones where if we can't save money there, we can at least save money there by having it put to better use, not processing AP kind of functions for paying our bills. So that was kind of the mindset we went through, but you can continue through here. There was some net savings here. So we found about $6,000 in total net, kind of mostly tech related expenses. That was just in terms of different kinds of account servicing and administration rights that certain different plans that we were on. We kind of streamlined things a little bit based off of what people actually needed to support their tech needs. And that was one where this helps support the actual increase of our website costs, because we're moving to a new, well, not a new provider, current provider on the next generation platform, which increases our tech expense. Well, that is now fully funded by savings in other areas of our technology services here. And we are still pursuing a business phone solution. So we're going to look to go away from possibly a Comcast service, go towards kind of like a more generic VoIP type solution that we can configure to work with not only our desktop phones, but obviously over the IP service there for the actual, if you're away from your desk, and still receive phone calls and forwarding services as well. That ends up being a lesser level expense because you're not having Comcast boogeyman, if you will, but not having it tied towards that. So just little measures like that, everything was considered. Next slide. So this is kind of the ending kind of encapsulation of the year over year differences. So you can see the difference. Just so people remember, the A1 budget was different than the actual original budget. So the original budget that was proposed and adopted last fall, last winter, because it was adopted in December, was 7.8 million. The budget amendment that we actually went through in that process in the spring timeframe walked out some kind of, we'll call them funds that probably should have been put in other parts of the budget. So we had capital fund related items put in the general fund to kind of prop that up. But we were able to bring that total balance down. But obviously from the year over year switches with those FTE increases, that kind of brings us up an additional 642 to get to that final budget number of 7.7 million. These are the net increases and decreases. So if you can think about it, this is what was added. This is what was subtracted in the net. So certain costs for services kind of ebbed and flowed, as well as the consolidation effort. So the total net increases was actually 757, but we were able to walk it back. So this is how much we were actually able to lower. So that got us to the 642, if that makes sense. This is one in terms of our current structural deficit. So right now, from a budgeted structural deficit, we are, because the only reason we used $946,000 this year was because we didn't achieve full staffing levels in certain areas. So we didn't actually get to it. But if we were fully staffed right now, based off of the current net deficit plus the increase, we would be at about a 1.6 million cash usage rate for a fully staffed organization, which we're not that far off from. So what does this mean for a proposed millage increase? So this is just utilizing FY23 base assessments. That's likely to maybe move by a couple $1 million to the left or the right, which equates to about a difference of like what, $3,000 to $5,000 total. So when you have a pretty, low millage rate overall, like it's an increase for us, but it's still a low millage rate. That's not really going to impact your net assessable values that you're pulling out of them from a millage perspective. So what that rate increase to cover that 1.6 gets us to about 2.18 with somewhat of a small structural surplus. And the reason the probably need to kind of continue a surplus is number one, revenue loss. We're in a moment in time right now where economic revenues are projecting downwards. So coming down for the previous shortage that we saw, plus we don't know if that trend's going to continue into 24. So that one that builds us a little bit of a margin. While also supplementing the non-usage of cash. So then we can use year-over-year revenue reductions to understand at this point what our year-over-year compensation should be from fund balance, as well as do we need to support more future increases should we experience more, or the other one, and we'll talk about it here in a little bit, is grow the economic revenues through other measures. And that's kind of what I've been talking about since we started this conversation, which is how do we make sure that we don't completely become dependent on real estate incremental increases year over year to support overall operations. And all, of course, this is for those other organizations that we contribute to, but we don't holistically control all aspects of their budget requirements as well. So what did this 24 plan? Well, I talked about recommended FTE level per service area. So at least one person overseeing a pretty scaled function for the township. So now we have staff in place that can do all aspects and complete things. And it sounds crazy to say that out loud, but that's kind of what the plan is to make sure that we have support in all areas. Competitive pay, albeit on the 21 analysis. So that's the only benchmark we really have right now. And just from those kind of areas, I think that we're at least in a competitive position. We're not strong, but we're competitive. Reduced surplus cost for service. So we went through and we leaned out all the fluff. So right now, this is a true up kind of needs-based budget, if you will. This includes, we haven't finalized, but at least includes the earmarks for those proposed potential public safety contribution increases as well. So that's at least included in here. We have to finalize those budgets with the Southern Chester County Regional Police and Avondale Fire Company, but at least we understand of what those numbers may or may not look like. Next slide. So what's not included? We're not increasing anything to our capital reserves. So we're not supporting the glide path that we have in terms of, we called it like the tactical minimums approach. This doesn't immediately improve that position. So we're continuing as proposed, but this doesn't immediately address that. The one thing is sufficient stormwater costs. We talk about stormwater, and when I talk about it, I talk about not just the actual required obligations to meet your MS4 compliance measures, but all of those reactive kind of hoping to be more in a proactive approach, infrastructure repairs. Tough Kenneman, you have all of the culverts. We'll talk about it here in a little bit as we walk down the budget, but we talked about what a culvert replacement plan even looked like. We have almost over 1,600 culverts. How much do they cost? The sleeve kind of thing. So if you do the math, based off of our current projected rate, we should be able to address all culverts in over 5 centuries. So that's our current approach right now. It's about 533 years to get through every single culvert in the township at that rate. So we don't really have a sufficient realistic culvert replacement plan or even to address it, but that's just the issue is we're in a township that has a lot of streams, brooks, runs, watersheds, whatever you name it. And we have a lot of dedication in those road right-of-ways where we have to support the culvert maintenance, and we don't have the structural capacity to even do anything about it in terms of what is the total risk for the town. Now, it's not to say that every culvert's going to fail tomorrow, but it's a liability that exists out there. Which, by the way, if we're going to ramp up there, we probably need to ramp up FTE to be able to support doing more repairs in addition to what you're currently doing. And then the other one is projected revenue increases. So we kept revenues pretty much flat because this is second-class township in Pennsylvania, revenues stay flat because they don't update assessments. And if you're not growing, you're not adding to your EIT. So you really can't project increases until you commission growth opportunities into active projects in your township. And of course, right now, that projected revenue increase is based off of a planned kind of, not planned, but estimated projected expenditure increase of roughly 2.5%, which is the CPI rate as an average. You know, this is kind of the year over year types of increases you're looking at. So every single year, you're talking about a 0.23 mil increase in total expenditures, just because of it's the cost of inflation, cost of everything. And we're just along with the ride there. You know, we are an organization that's I guess, different than anyone else in terms of exposure towards macroeconomic forces that we can't control. So as products and goods and services goes up, you know, so does our needs from an expenditure cost coverage standpoint. So I wanted to finalize this with some municipal benchmarks. It's good to kind of know where you sit. So this is from the second, assuming the state of the township brief, same kind of 10 jurisdictions that we had. So you can quickly pop those up there. But, you know, this kind of shows, I sorted it by assessed values, but in terms of our kind of footprint, you know, this is kind of where we sit from total assessed values. These are all FY23 values for all of these jurisdictions. You know, so we're roughly in, what is that, 7th place. But with that, you know, if you remember primary tax revenue, which is your sum of all your primary real estate, so it includes kind of delinquency collections, EIT, that includes local services, transfers, EIT, and that gets us to pretty much, and not even kind of in a close 9th position where we're pretty much dead last in terms of primary revenues. And if for the most part, you can see the relationship, your primary revenue makes up the significant percentage of your total expenditure profile. So what you get kind of, it justifies and indicates what you can actually achieve in terms of your overall expenditures. So the gap here is actually even more of a gap between some at the top. So you can see like we're pretty far behind when it comes to competitive primary tax revenues to justify expenditures. And the other good part about this is we're actually not even inflating our total expenditures here too. So even if you look at it, you know, this is of course for 23, 24 will go up to 7.7 recommended, but that still gets us in that kind of bottom third component of what our total expenditure profile is. So it's not like we're trying to just shoot the moon in expenditures here. We're trying to, and everybody here kind of has the same kind of elements going on. You know, we're not just doing stuff for the sake of increasing. This is justified increases to get to where we need to go. And these are the townships we use to compare from a staffing standpoint. And I said in FY20, we were at least at a minimum 50% lower staffing than all of these jurisdictions. So the proposed real estate increase to 3.9. So that's the 2.18 increase from 1.72. You can see kind of where that gets us, at least from a primary tax revenue. So we're kind of neck and neck with everybody with some measures here. That's just because our millage rate has a little bit more, because from these jurisdictions, we do have somewhat of a higher tax base. So we do get a little bit more from that. The reason that we're in front of these is because, you know, they don't even have an EIT measure. So our primary revenues gets us up at least to the middle of the pack there. And they're the same way. They millage at a significantly lower rate, but that's also because they have a significant amount more of EIT. So the more this, the less you need of this. But you can see even at that rate, our closure for covering up most of the other remaining expenses in terms of fees and revenues from permits and everything else like that kind of enables us to get closer towards reducing the risk of revenue loss from EIT. And another one is like I said, it kind of gets us into that same kind of benchmark wheelhouse of, you know, we're not increasing this and increasing that at the same rate. We're staying within the same lower third. So we're spending within our means too. And then I'll always, you know, kind of continue to harp on this one, but I think we're still low in the EIT respect. We're just above the township that doesn't have any. So that's, and you can see kind of where we scale up here, but that is what I would consider. You can hit on the next button here. This is kind of our growth opportunity. And I will continue to kind of recommend that the township pursue its achievable growth through the recommended efforts that's laid out in the comprehensive plan. So we can increase this, so we don't have to increase this, if that makes sense. And you can see our 3.9 rate, we're kind of in line with everybody else. And this is 23. I don't have no idea if these people are recommending increases right now. But I can assume that if they're experiencing the same thing that we are, these are all realistic outcomes for all of these jurisdictions. So if you don't have strong EIT revenues, you have to rely on your real estate base in order to do what you are required to do, which we are actually on the lower ends of those as well. So this is very much in line with New Garden Township kind of correcting its prior inefficiencies from a overall operating budget standpoint. And I think that's it. So I will leave it open to any questions. We have all department directors here to kind of ask questions, but we can probably go ahead and open the budget and kind of walk down some of the expenditure stuff. But I also just wanted to start with if you had any general questions about the brief before we go into the general fund line items.
Chris, when are you forecasting the full benefit of the Purolite building being occupied?
So they're not projected to go live until FY25. So we wouldn't see those EIT. When does EIT start getting assessed for? Yeah. Yeah. So it's quarterly in lumps, and then it kind of leans out. So it's like you'll get it in month one, and then you'll get a little bit less, and then a little bit less, and then you plus up. So if they're not fully live by January 25, we would see that economic revenue as of April 2025. And that's kind of based off of their timelines of when they told us they would be up and running. Hmm. And anything in terms of new growth from new housing opportunities, like if you have a residential development that we have on book, post sale closure, I think it's about a 2-month or 1-month lag as if it gets recorded by the recorder of deeds and gets processed through and comes back to the township. So those are pretty close to being within the same, maybe at most a 2-month lag for transfer taxes as well.
Robert, can you back up? I think it's 14 municipal benchmarks. It was the first page that shows the square mileage.
Yes.
Okay, so on our iPad, I don't know if it comes through on the computer, but we don't have the full chart on some of these like you have there.
Okay.
I just wanted to see Kennett Township's 19 square miles, New Garden. So we are
Yeah.
the third largest per square miles.
I was actually joking about this with staff, but yeah, I'm sorry.
No, and I think when you ask about whether they're facing the same tax increases, many of those raised taxes last year.
Yes.
So.
And I believe Kennett is now 1 year fully matured into their CBA. They're going to be going into year 2. So I would imagine that those incremental increases in terms of officers assuming higher level pay rates year over year from terms of when their scaling kind of step measures take into effect, that's going to be a lifting cost. So they're, I mean, if they don't have a planned increase to combat that increase, then I don't know where else they would supplement supplement the necessary amount of revenue to cover that incremental increase year over year, as well as they also, for the Longwood Fire Commission, everybody increased a pretty significant amount as well. So that's also going to lift a lot of people's cost appetites. So we might be temporarily 3.9 kind of at the front of that, but we might be past 2 years from now or a year from now.
So I guess my question there would be population density.
Yep.
We are higher than Kennett Township and we're higher than, let's just say Willistown. Does that mean we have more miles of roads to maintain?
Not necessarily. It depends. Because this one doesn't also include how much state roads relationships they have there. But in terms of actual like benchmark, like our township doppelganger, I was actually talking about this with staff earlier. It's actually Cowan Township. They're probably the most closely aligned to us. I mean, I think they have advantage because they have a business corridor for Route 30 going through there. So that can provide other economic kind of support as well as the 30 corridor. So they actually have kind of a 2-for-1. So in that respect, they actually have a more justifiable ability to attract and retain commercial business than we do with just having Route 41. But in terms of kind of where we're at across the board, they're the most closely aligned to us across the board from not only a demographic standpoint, but from a cost perspective as well. So they're the most aligned with the township. So being somewhat newer to the area, I don't know what that means in terms of people's perceptions of Cowan Township, but that's kind of what I see us closely as, just based off of all the factors that we have here. Because Kennett is population wise this, but they're not growing really that much anymore. So they're going to be well below us into perpetuity. And if we grow, that gap is only going to increase because that's just not within their scope right now to add more substantive scale developments to their township.
Right.
I think they're just anchoring certain improvements around the borough outside kind of in proximity. And they're still treating like, I forgot what the name was, it McFarland Road or whatever it is. What's the north south? Yeah, that's kind of like their hemisphere and like zero activity on the entire eastern side. So of their 19 square miles, half of that is just untouched.
Correct.
So Robert, if you can go on the folder in there. And we can probably stop sharing the presentation. I was going to pull up the budget spreadsheet. If you want, actually, if you can, all right, so we'll start it there. So this is the actual spreadsheet that I had. This was forwarded out to all the Board of Supervisors over the weekend as we finalize the actual budget plan here. But this is what I'm using as the static budget spreadsheet to post online to kind of improve the ability from a resident, if they have an interest in our budget and they want to know, here's a spreadsheet, has everything. It's Excel based, they can go in there, they can play around with it. We'll remove all formulas, so the numbers will just be the numbers. And this will be what they can see in terms of I'll call it a more engageable kind of medium from a budget perspective. So what you can see right there in column H, that's kind of the net expenditure, the net revenue increases as we implement the real estate increase. If you want to just go over to, I think it's like column like K or something, just kind of scroll over a little bit. Excuse me, if you scroll back up a little bit. So we had the distribution breakdown of percentages towards different kind of categories in terms of how we earmark certain types of real estate taxes towards services. And so I think that was done in 2021 or 22. I can't remember when that was implemented. But you can see the percentages get reduced. And right now, the actual earmark measures are kind of to cover services and their full entirety. So the big takeaway is our previous funding levels allocated those percentages, but they didn't provide enough. Our current base provides those percentages and it provides it enough. So therefore it reduces the percentage requirement. So we're actually able to increase the usage of general fund to cover operating expenses outside of fire and the library, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what that means. If you're tracking here is we used to be able to only use 41% of the total lower amount, which is equated to about $587,000 in total revenue. And if you scroll back over, that's able to go to 2.12. So we're still kind of earmarking full funding of fire and EMS services as proposed, but we're able to get more out of the real estate just for general fund type operations. So that's kind of the net impact there. We're going from 587 across the board. So we're still increasing everything or keeping it the same based off the increase, but now we're able to get more from our real estate tax to actually fund operations in our. Just click OK. Another one is I want to highlight, we'll only concentrate on the highlighted areas. In case you have other questions, let me know. But this was the net proposed rate for future transfer taxes. As you can see, it's about $80,000 lower. It's just the realization that we're starting to see some slowdown in our transfer tax viability. This might actually come in lower than next year based off of where it might be going. We have no idea, but we wanted to make sure we weren't reporting higher than expected revenues that we're not likely to see. So that was a net revenue loss. You can probably scroll down. I don't think we have any more highlighted areas in our, you'll see this in certain other measures in a final prepared product, but this is the ARPA funding that's going to be supporting our grants coordinator for the next 18 months. So this is going to be revenue that we're replacing into the actual budget. So that FTE count that we have from 24, the majority of 25 is supported by ARPA funding. So that's actually not a realized net expenditure for the township right now, because it's one where as ARPA goes, we already have the millage increase to kind of supplement that as we go forward from 25 and beyond until the net CPI index catches back up with us. And now we're back kind of in a need to reassess our revenues. Continue to scroll down. This was just for all the fees. We're kind of benchmark it right now because we don't have anything really to base it against. And then we're going to adjust these accordingly. So these were based off of a best estimate from kind of other jurisdictions. And then if we end up coming in higher or lower, we can say that we're not at least inflating the expected revenue coming from our inspection programs. But at least they're earmarked and they're put in there now that we approve the rental inspection and fire code for commercial inspections. Keep scrolling. And then, of course, the big measure here is no longer structuring use of cash to balance the budget. So that is a zero now, when that's kind of where it should be for the most part, until like we get into some sort of probably like untenable situation or an emergency or anything like that. But through an amendment process, if we have to supplement it. But that was the big goal in this one too, is stop the hemorrhaging out of our general fund cash balance and zero that number out in its complete entirety. So that's one thing we're doing from a fiscal policy standpoint, is only using fund cash to balance out unplanned expenditure or revenue loss type things from an end funding balance standpoint, if that makes sense. Keep on scrolling down. No, we can keep scrolling down, trying to get to some of the bigger measures here. Actually increase a little bit. Scroll up. This is one we're just showing, and that's the expenditure for the actual staff position, but it's offset by ARPA funding. And also their total benefits are included in that revenue number there. So it's FTE, salary, and benefits. Keep scrolling down. Another one is a good thing. We're only planning on one audit next year, not two. So we don't have to do another forensic audit. So it actually lowers our operating expense a little bit as well. Keep going. Another one, small one, but one that we kind of popped up in the last minute. And I don't think the county kind of realized that if you give us a month to determine how we can collect real estate revenues, because you're increasing the actual cost of collections from, was it $2 to $4? Yeah. Yeah. The net increase is a doubling of our current thing, but they gave us this summary in like end of September with a notification to get them in response by November, in the middle of a budget planning cycle. We're not able to vet services. So we're going to recommend to move forward, because that's kind of currently who we have at least a a expected relationship with. So something that we can explore in the future, but I still don't believe that we can provide a adequate building service in short notice to be able to handle real estate collections. And that's something I want to like completely upset, the current process right now, even though it is a planned increase, but that's the reason why it's going up. And that was Chester County. I keep going down. This is one where we increased this by decreasing other areas. And so what we had in our budget on every single general fund department level was a sequestered fund, some sort of like contingency fund baked into it. And so the one thing we noticed is that all of our line items already had a bit of a contingency baked into them, as well as the sequester lineup. But one thing that we don't have, because we actually don't have an active HR manager, somebody who oversees our human resources function in terms of the kind of SHRM related professional certified kind of HR, is we didn't have anything to support wellness campaigns and organizational kind of employee kind of events and stuff like that. So those kind of morale kind of things. And this is one way to do that. So this is actually the repurposing of sequestered funds. So you'll see sequestered funds zeroed out, and it's actually to build up a balance to support 21 FTE with our airport department as well in terms of actual staffing events. So that explains the increase there, if that makes sense. This is another one that we had actuals to support a lowering of our engineering services, because for the most part, what we started doing this year was managing escrow outside of engineering service in a separate reported line, because escrow is supported with development revenues. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't showing that this is how much we spend per year on engineering. Another one is as we continue to, well, not continue to, now that we have consolidated all of our engineering relationships into two primary organizations, which is Pannoni as our primary engineer and Bowman, formerly McMahon, as our transportation engineer. Our scope of kind of like charted out engineering kind of related expenses for all sorts of projects, which kind of got probably a little bit too leaned out. This is a way to hopefully kind of consolidate certain measures, and we're not getting overcharged and overbilled and stuff like that from an engineering. Another one is you'll see this more for actuals, but we're going to report actuals per department area, so you can see kind of what the actual department justifications are for engineering services as well, because that's who they're generally supporting is projects for the most part, and ongoing analysis and understanding of the needs of the township as we approach capital projects. Another one is this formerly was called the general government, or is it this other general government? I can't remember. But we wanted to kind of consolidate. So the way I think of it is if you're familiar with the general services department, it's kind of the miscellaneous department, which most commonly hosts your fleet and facilities. So now that we have somewhat of a fleet function now, as well as facilities kind of consolidated a little bit, we wanted to put all of our utilities. So this is all town hall and public works facility utilities on one bill. Like I said, they were getting sent all over the place. This consolidates to one line item. And then the other one in terms of we'll monitor for in terms of vehicle maintenance for our 7 vehicle fleet, which is why it's at a pretty low number, plus the brand new vehicles. So the hope is, we don't have extraneous maintenance repairs, and then overall gas expenditures as well for them. But these were all kind of put into everyone else's department line item. So we zeroed those out and consolidated everything here, except for the diesel requirements for public works, which is left in place. Keep going down. This includes the planned CBA type increase, as well as some other types of, we'll call them contingency, until we get a final reported police budget. From my discussions with Chief Greenwald, it's going to be somewhere around there, possibly lower, but we're not until we finalize everything. But so I played it at the most conservative upper bounds. That's also with these two numbers as well, after discussions with the Avondale Fire Company, who they will be here on October 23rd in those meetings to talk about their individual line item budgets, of which parts of those will include the township's contribution. So probably shelve the commentary until those are complete. And if you have any questions, let me know. But that's kind of, at least right now, supplementing the immediate kind of recommendations based off of those discussions. Community development safety was one where we did a lot of right sizing over the course of the last probably 18 months, if you will. But this supports a fully staffed organization, primarily with the part-time requirements in terms of a fire marshal and a supplemental code enforcement officer. But at the minimum, when you get rid of those, it's a 3 kind of FTE based department. So that's the plan in place right now. So we have that fully staffed. So that's good part is now we have a fully staffed FTE count development function for the township. And of course, all of the services that they provide. It keeps going. Just another one in terms of just some confusing measures. I wanted to, one of these, this is for our own trash bill. This is for community events, for like hazardous waste disposals, other kind of campaigns that we do. So if we look at this and we start getting recommendations or inputs from residents that want to have more kind of community events, this is where we would structure this in our budget and plan for possible increases, or try to see what else we can possibly do from a, we'll call it like spring cleanup event. If we want to do multiple shred events, if we want to do hazardous waste events, you know, that's kind of where that is. But before, one was called recycling and one was called waste, and they actually weren't really for either. So that's kind of what that means now going forward. Keep scrolling. This is the total net increase for the Public Works Department for what is going to be an 8 FTE. That's inclusive of director. So 7 FTE for the general kind of body. And if you take the roadmaster out of that, it's kind of the 6 FTE kind of core labor, roads laborer workforce, roadmaster and the director. But this is inclusive of 7 of those 8 FTE in this count here. So the actual total net increase, granted, this was originally planned as a budget perspective, be 388. It's actually going up net year over year, you know, by a very small margin. This was because we didn't have a quarter's worth of planned FTE. We actually had less than that through the course of the year because we weren't able to really get any initial talent in the door at the projected rate. But just know that that increase of the $23 to $26.90 didn't have a sizable net increase on the overall budget from prior years. So to me, it's an incredible value add for where we were to where we need to get to be more competitive. Another one too is this is only realized for first year, but this is inclusive of CDL trainings. So if we are able to hire people who need it, we have the ability to do 2 CDL certifications per year for the next years, because we're planning on adding, was it net total 3 new FTE, correct? Because we might have the people coming in at the end of the year plus Jeff's replacements as well. So yeah, correct. So if those people don't have CDLs, this is kind of keeps us to be able to give them CDLs, plus current staff as well that might not have a CDL that we can get it. Another one for public works supplies. The only reason I want to highlight this was we had funding for salt in our general fund and in our liquid fuels. The total net of that equated to about 50,000. It is better to support liquid fuels to cover only paving and as much as it as possible to kind of squeeze every ounce and dollar out of our public paving funds when we have a justification to possibly modestly increase. So net total, we were actually funding in 2 different measures because our liquid fuels revenue wasn't covering salt and paving. So it's like, well, let's just pull that expense out of that budget for future planning purposes. And the total net cost of the township is no different. It's just from 2 different funds, but it's consolidated. And that hopefully, you know, is this going to be salt every year? You know, we might have ebbs and flows to that based off of obviously winter events. This year we were very low, which is why we, you know, want to make sure that we always at least have an upper bound. And if we need to go up one year, so it's just kind of a net variable that we'll always have to deal with. Keep going. This is just one for supplemental seasonal staff. And it's one of the biggest reasons that after talking with our Parks and Recreation Director was we were using our parks facility maintenance staff significantly to host and support events. This is like on a Saturday being there, which was increasing overtime. So in order to reduce overtime at a modest amount extra for seasonal staff, this allows to, you know, kind of outsource that function, driving up overtime for our parks maintenance facilities. And another one too is if we get to a point where we scale parks up enough after we do the full implementation of 3 parks, if there are more kind of support for adding FTE to support whatever we realize at those parks in the future, this might be a good way to kind of establish a relationship with someone that might want to convert at some point to a full-time staff member. So that's another kind of, you know, can lay the seed for a possibility for a new opportunity hire down the road. Forgot I glossed over this. This was the money that we had in the FY23 budget to address culverts. So this will get you about 2 culverts a year out of the 1,600. So this is kind of why we're on a charted path for 533 years, I think we said, to do it through all of them. So that's kind of one where this is just a number to do something, but it's not even close to the requirement and the scale that's needed to get it done. So that was at least in terms of a recommended. Plus, there was another one where we didn't have enough FTE to be able to do the projects in themselves this year because we went down to one point where we had 3 to 4 people at one point for public works. Yeah. So it's just, you're limited to what you can do based off of who you have available. And so that was another one that at least going into FY24, based off of the realized possible hires we might achieve by the end of the year, we'll at least be fully staffed. We can at least consider doing our 2 culvert repairs that we have at least on the book for FY24. And keep scrolling down. This was the Parks budget. You'll see 01 and then you'll see 05. These are all the consolidated funds for Parks and New Garden Hills. So we will redo the general fund GL line items for the Parks and Recreation Department. So you see it's a very long budget. The goal will be to consolidate it once it's finally approved. We didn't want to do it all at once. Plus, we wanted to show people kind of where these funds were coming from. And this was kind of the areas where we talked about net reductions in terms of maintenance and repairs, improvements, maintenance and repairs, maintenance and repairs. And then, so we did a lot of kind of like consolidation there. And that's why we went from that 180 number down to a 106 total number, which is supportive of maintenance and repairs, plus pop-up contingencies for engineering services for pop-up costs outside of the normal engineering as well, because those are kind of pop-up expenses. And I didn't want to just have variability based into our actuals on our engineering line item. There's another one. Keep scrolling. So the last one here really was we wanted to put all of kind of our larger level insurance and compensation kind of obligations into one. These were kind of stratified out into multiple different funds, but they go to the same resource and we pay them from one central billed account. So this was one where it made sense just to consolidate here. So we pulled these out of our administrative other than general government's fund. So everything is now included on one line item. So you can track easier to see the total net relationship the township might have from a pension change, because the liability insurance was the only one that was ever really here year over year, and our workers' compensation plans. So you can see those kind of writ at large now, more so than where they were when they're kind of buried in the line items. And that's it. The 243 stays flat. We just made it, instead of going transfer to capital reserve, it's now transferred to capital because we are immediately going to be using this funding for capital projects starting in 24. And that gets us to our net differential, which that's the structural surplus right now that will immediately be required for net potential revenue losses should they happen, as well as just ebbs and flows with other revenues as well. So I'll leave that for any questions.
Good. None.
No, it looks great. Thank you.
So when do we talk about how we're going to grow revenue?
But when we grow, so the big part will be number one. We already have 2 projects that are already in queue. They're just being halted right now by Pennsylvania, was it Chester Water Authority and Aqua in terms of sewage planning. I call them like final agreements for, I guess it's like the cost sharing component of them. So right now they're having issues with the Thompson property, Short Brothers, as well as the Ross Chamberlain one as well, or I think it's with Thompson, but it will probably be realized also by Short Brothers. Those are relationships that we don't control. But with that, I think those 2 planned developments bring in roughly about 150-ish units total. So that's just natural residential growth that will also incur EIT growth as well. The other one that I think doesn't have a planned land development application in, but at least has gone through the zoning hearing process, is the one off of Sheehan Road. That's a much smaller scale type development, but those are at least 3 housing developments. And of course, the big one is White Clay Point. You know, that's the indeterminate one where we are just waiting for a response to the township's extension letter for providing another, I guess, land development application. That will come due in April. They will have to provide something. So the whole point was from our conversations with M Capital that in April, you can submit prior to that, but in April, we're not going to extend anymore. You have to submit something and we will go through the process, and that will kick off that part of the campaign as well. So unless they have a very little good reason. But right now, I believe they're doing some retooling efforts on their side, and we're just waiting for them to come back forward. But that would be one where the ones I just mentioned prior to that, White Clay Point would be like all of those combined 3 to 4-fold. So really, that is the first kind of, once that gets realized, substantive increase in EIT that would be beyond just the ability to cover marginal 2.5% increases. That one would be able to provide a significant amount extra for the township in terms of scaling type event for economic impact. And then from there, it's other things that we can do as township. You know, we talked about kind of what are underlying kind of goals in the comprehensive plan that permit growth. A lot of it is looking at what our zoning actually achieves along our Route 41 and Baltimore Pike corridors. Is the permissible use there actually in line with what are justifiable kind of business opportunities in 2023 and what's actually getting achieved in other sectors? So that's going to require a bit of an analysis, which we now have some increased staff on hand. We can actually kind of go through that a little bit. Another one is the township's infrastructure kind of abates plan development opportunities because of the inability to service our stormwater infrastructure, as well as a lot of the streets kind of issues right now where we're still kind of anchored by street corridors that are very kind of not up to par for 2023 kind of transportation kind of thoroughfares. And so if you're a business coming in, your plan improvements are going to be kind of untenable when you add those types of costs up together. So there's another one that, you know, the township is not able to kind of incrementally improve that to lessen the burden for potential future business, if that makes sense. But those are the areas that we can explore and try to activate more, if that's what you're asking in terms of where we need it. It would be through those immediate ventures would be my kind of 24 to 25 recommendations to focus on.
Did you have anything else? Should we close?
No, I just wanted to provide a summary, go through the line items of what's changing. You know, it's a $7.7 million budget, so it's not, you know, wholly kind of, in this case, complex to kind of a document to kind of walk through. Hopefully it's sorted out in a pretty sensible manner here as well. So if anybody has any questions, not just from the board, but if you get any kind of probing questions from residents, plan to kind of do a summary version of this for the October 16th meeting next week. Just to continue to say that obviously we've been kind of saying that the recommendation is to do a right sizing of real estate taxes. And so I know that's probably the biggest obstacle to get through now is that kind of proposed increase. So hopefully at this point, we've provided enough context as to what that really means from not only impacts to base assessments for properties, but also kind of what that means from a township perspective of where we were, where we're going to, and what we need to get there. So I think, and in context of other jurisdictions, we're not an outlier. And well, we were an outlier because we were so wholly far behind, but this actually gets us to where we kind of need to be.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, so like you said, the next Board of Supervisor meeting will be at Monday, regular annual or monthly meeting, I should say, 7 p.m. and then one more budget meeting for October at 5:30 on the 23rd. So
For October, yes.
So having no other business, we're going to go ahead and can I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn the budget meeting. I'll second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All right, meeting is adjourned.